get through this.
Easy for this. I wasn't able to do it.
Easy to dance. I'm not a great lover of cats.
That's my fear.
You're a disgrace, you are. Not me.
That's my fear.
You're a disgrace, you are.
Hello and welcome to One-on-One Shadowboxing. Today my guest is Professor Jörg Imberger from the Western University, or University of WA.
Western Australia, that's correct.
Yes. Jörg, what is your position now as a professor? What's you heading as a...
Well, I run the Centre for Water Research at the University of Western Australia, and I'm very grateful to that place for giving me a fair amount of freedom.
And what's your field of research?
Yeah, I started my career in lakes and, well, actually backtrack. When I was an undergraduate student, my vision was to be a civil engineer and build dams. And that very quickly, I went up the snowy mountains and I met all these immigrants, and I was an immigrant. And the only attribute I had to have was to be able to drink beer at great quantities, and I decided that wasn't for me. So now I've moved more and more environmental engineering, but always on the fluid mechanics, how water moves, how it mixes and so forth. And then now I'm realizing two extra things. One is the biological world is actually very dependent on the fluid mechanics, just like your body. I mean, without fluid mechanics, you couldn't live.
And we are almost 80% of water.
Water, that's right. And
so
it's moving around doing its thing. And the same thing like the algal bloom in the Swan River is very much dependent on the water temperature, also on the nutrients, but on the water motion, on how it mixes, how it moves in turbulence and so forth.
I think we're getting to the topic now. The first question is, what's wrong with the Swan River? Not just what's wrong with the river, but what's happening with the Swan, the Trust.
Okay.
The Swan Trust.
Okay.
So, which one you pick first?
Let's go back just a little bit before the white people came here. There was a rock outcrop at Fremantle and a sandbar and so forth, so the Swan River was predominantly fresh water. And the thing that people have to remember is that if you have salt water underneath fresh water, it's stable because salt water is heavier. So if you put a Campari and orange, I think,
into the
glass. I can't remember now. Campari goes to the bottom and orange goes to the top, or one of the other two. You've got to mix it. Well, that's what's happened when the rock pool was cut, or the rock bar was cut out by Seaway O'Connor, who was a great engineer. The seawater came in. But until about 1970, that didn't matter so much, even though it was stable, because once in a year or twice in a year, there would be enough rainfall to flush the whole system out, right?
So renewed itself.
That's right, cleaned itself out. So what's happened since 1970 is very interesting, and people are very confused about this, I think. The inland rainfall stopped. Well, not stopped, but decreased dramatically. The wheat belt and the catchment of Swan River, and all the reservoirs are now, the drinking water reservoirs now short of water. But the reason for that, if you analyze the coastal rainfall stations from the Bureau of Meteorology, they didn't decrease in rainfall at all. So what's happening is the trees, which were on the coastal strip between the coast and the escarpment, were cut for development and so forth. And a tree, think about it, if it rains in Western Australia, you multiply the area times the rain, it's an enormous amount of water. Where does that water go? You look in the Swan River, there's hardly any water.
So what's happening with the water?
What's happening with the water? It's not going into the deep aquifer because that's 100,000 years old. So what's happening is it goes into the top 20 meters of the ground, and then the tree pulls it out and passes back to the atmosphere, mixes it because it's tall in the wind turbulence. And then it's very clever. It puts little carbon particles in the atmosphere, which then seed the rain for inland. And if you go to Western Australia, you'll see the rain is no longer propagating inland. If you go to Russia...
Because no trees.
No trees. You go to Russia, it's no longer propagating inland. If you go to Brazil, it's no longer propagating inland. And I didn't realize until very recently, Germany apparently was a desert 500 years ago because all the trees had been cut for charcoal. So they replanted the trees and the rain was carried back in again. But now, unfortunately, since 2000, global warming has shifted the cold fronts further south, and now we're also getting a decrease in the coastal rainfall. So the net effect in 1970 was that the river had less rain, or the catchment had less rain, less flow came down. So now what you have is that the fresher water goes over the top, doesn't flush it, just sits over the top and seals it off. It's a wonderful environment for algae. So the algae grows in the surface layer. That's what's happening. The algae, when it dies, sinks to the bottom into this stagnant pool underneath. Bacteria break it down, consume all the oxygen. So at the moment from Point Walter to Guildford, past Guildford, there is no life in the bottom left anymore. Because it can't. I mean,
Couldn't exist.
The oxygen is less than
Just cut off
2
the
milligrams.
oxygen, yes.
That's right. So
for that reason, probably we got the Swan Trust
that's right.
to solve the problem or monitoring it.
Yeah, but I feel sorry for them in some ways because, first of all, their funding was continually cut. Secondly, they had strict orders from the minister always to do certain things. And thirdly, they lost a lot of their expertise that they used to have. So
they couldn't find a solution.
They couldn't find a solution. So they were forced into solutions like the bubble plume, the oxygenator upstream. You've probably heard of that.
Yes. But that's not
a total waste of money. It's like if you have 20 people dying, you put one on life support, giving them oxygen. You say, oh, I fixed the problem.
No, not happened, yes.
And so I'm not sure. And they were a bit of a thorn in the side of the government, I think. So they got rid of them in the sense that didn't get rid of them.
Is that solving the problem if we get rid of the Swan Trust?
No.
And got someone else to say, no, you are the Swan Trust. We're changing the name.
Changing the name only and putting them under a different organization. Well, it solves the government problem because they're part of a bigger machine now, so they'll disappear.
And it don't cost that much.
No. But you know, the solution to the Swan River are broader and they're symptomatic of what's happening in Western Australia generally. Obviously, if you could reduce the nutrients, and Colin Porter, the ex-EPA chairman, still thinks you can, working internationally, I don't see any evidence anywhere in the world that we can convince the agricultural industry to stop using fertilizer. It doesn't make any sense.
And Monsanto don't like that idea either.
Yeah, I mean, there are some more friendly fertilizers than others, but I think it's a hopeless task. We lost that battle because we designed the dorsal cut in Peel Harvey, and it's now algae's coming back because the catchment management didn't follow up.
So, Jörg, what do you think? What is the way to solve the problem?
Solution? Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, the long-term solution clearly is to bring more rain back. So every year it flushes out and we go back to prior.
We need trees.
We need trees. And now, you know, that's a wonderful solution because if once you plant the trees, you get more rain for the Swan River, you fill up the reservoirs for the West Australian Water Corporation, drinking water. You sequester about half of West Australia's carbon emissions. You lower the health costs because people will go out and picnic again and see animals and plants and so forth. It's a win-win situation all around. So, you know, it's just symptomatic that the imagination or the boldness or 20 years, you know, I talk to senior politicians and administrators, 20 years we can't. Trees take 20 years to grow at least, you know, that's too long, you know, I won't be in office anymore.
Ah, yes, they're not in office, so they need to produce something which is instant solution.
All right, so I've been thinking about instant solutions.
Yes, Jörg.
One is to put a barrage at Fremantle, so under the bridge, for instance, to stop the salt water from coming in.
Yes.
Then the nutrients will still be there, but at least the wind can mix things up and it'll be oxygen to the bottom and the prawns and the crabs and so forth. The bugs
so the movement
can come back again. That's right. So then I'm told, well, the boats need to get in and out. Well, that's all right. We put a barrage over half the mouth. We put a lock at the other half, which is automatic. So when, like when you go into your garage at home, you know, you don't get out and open the garage. Some electronic thing triggers it. So I've got 2 students working on that to design a barrage at Fremantle, or maybe the Narrows Bridge, or maybe the Canning Mount Henry Bridge. So that's another possibility. Then let's look at the nutrient issues again a little bit. And the last thing is, I guess, also we need to stop this development on the edges of the Swan River. And the Swan River Trust tried the fringing vegetation and so forth. But the main thing is, you know, when algae grows, it needs warm water, it needs nutrients, and it needs light. Well, if the water in Western Australia, in fact, all of Australia, all the estuaries, tea trees and so forth, tea trees that produce tannins.
Yes.
Just like you put leaves in a tea cup, this used to go into the river, and the water was brown for most of the year. And of course, if the water's brown, the light can't get down, the algae can't grow. If you walk out now, the water's kind of brown. As soon as that brownness goes away, in a couple of months' time, we'll have a massive algal bloom because the conditions are all set. So we need to move that development back a little bit from the Swan River. We need to plant these trees down south. It could potentially be great. And then we need to think about how to market all this, right? Do you want to have a miniature Singapore down here, like Elizabeth Key? where you just second-rate Singapore or a second-rate Hong Kong
or
a
even second-rate Sydney or
That's right.
Melbourne. That's not.
Or think of this vision.
Yes.
You take Kings Park, you take the biodiversity in the southwest, and you bring Kings Park down all along the foreshore to the causeway. So all along there would be this huge biodiversity. Then if somebody asked in the world, what's the garden city of the world? Instantly Perth would be coming to their mind.
Yes.
The tourist potential for that is enormous.
So not necessarily need to follow what's worked in Sydney or in Singapore because we're different.
It's exactly the
and
opposite.
what's wrong to recognize the difference? What's wrong
you
with
need courage to be different, Thibault.
You need courage and politicians who can recognize and live with the difference and not copying something which has cost billions of dollars, which we not have anyway.
Yeah.
And no one really want to invest in buying these blocks at the Swan River now when we started developing.
It's a bit of a risk, I think, for the developers, because I was walking along the Swan River about 6 months ago, a year ago, and I bumped into this old timer, and he said, Jörg, why are they building this Elizabeth Quay where it is? And I said, what do you mean? Well, when I was a kid, we used to go swimming in the Swan River, but everybody avoided that spot because it was full of garbage. So you invest in a big hotel, a big building, and then every year there's a big algal bloom at your doorstep.
And you're living next to a garbage.
Yeah.
Yes, it's not really
It's not really a good investment.
So we somehow need to recognize the priorities, resolve the problem.
Market our attributes rather than marketing some pseudo attributes from London or from somewhere else, you know. And then if you take, for instance, Lake Munga.
Yes.
Perry Lakes. I mean, they're just wonderful. You know, our icon bird, the black swan.
Yes,
nests,
it's coming from there, yes.
Yeah. And yet we build a freeway which overhangs the lake. So it's symptomatic of a short-term gain. And
so what do you think, Jörg, why we're making such stupid common mistakes in life?
Well, two main reasons, I think. That, first of all, we're not absorbing technology the way we should be. I mean, you go around and everybody that you meet, right, has this thing in their hand. What did you say, Thibault? So their skills of, think of a small child getting up in the morning out of bed, mother or father tells them what to wear, then they have breakfast while they're texting while they're having breakfast. Then they go into the car, there's a television, or they're texting. They go to school, they're not really listening to the teacher, they're texting. So they never develop the skills. Like when I was a kid, we had to walk to school, we had to make decisions about can you cross the road. I mean, these are trivial decisions, but your brain develops as you make these decisions. You learn to understand fear, you understand danger, all these sort of things, you know. We're not teaching those skills anymore because our life has changed.
On that note, Jörg, sorry, we have to go for a short break.
Okay.
But please stay with us, because after the break we're coming back with more discussion of the environment and our task for the future with Jörg.
And the opportunities for Western Australia.
And also the opportunities probably for Western Australia.